Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
All the better for being reunited with you, Michael. It's been a horrible week, off with the flu, and now I'm back.
You were off with the because we were hanging out in person at lunchtime today for Moya Lovia McLean's leaving lunch. But I hope you didn't pass that on to me. I wasn't aware that there was a flu involved in the situation.
No, I was off last week, and then obviously we saw each other in person. But I think of this as a totally different thing. I want to be reunited with you in screen form as well as in all three dimensions in person.
Okay, that's coherent. That adds up. Coming up later tonight, bus services across the country will soon be able to be brought back into public ownership. Positive story there. Right-wingers have accused the BBC of being biased against Israel. Are they just doing what we do, but from the other side? We'll discuss that. And the Green Party's conference over the weekend has seen them make some significant changes to their policy positions. Do stay tuned for all of that. First, though, another Labour rebellion could be brewing. Keir Starmer may have to face down a backbench rebellion when MPs debate his cut to the pensioners' winter fuel payment tomorrow. Up to 50 Labour MPs are considering whether to abstain or be absent from the vote on the cut. I often consider whether or not to turn up for work. That seems to be what's happening here. Of course, I say abstain or be absent because reports are suggesting that very few Labour MPs will be prepared to vote against the government tomorrow. That follows the suspension of the 7 MPs who voted against the 2-child benefit cap in the King's speech in July. 17 Labour MPs have, though, signed an early day motion against scrapping the winter fuel allowance ahead of tomorrow's vote. Signed an early day motion to say we want to postpone scrapping universal winter fuel payments, but at the same time, they're probably going to be too scared to vote against the actual bill that's going to change it. All a little bit complicated. Others are also speaking off the record. So the Times has published this comment from one of them. The postbox is filling up. It's very significant. We're getting emails daily. Constituents are deeply unhappy. And some are saying they will never vote Labour again. We're very early in a new government for them to be getting these emails. I don't know if this is a physical postbox or a sort of metaphorical one and it's their inbox, but lots of people very annoyed already at this policy from the Labour Party. Another backbench MP said this: I think the frontbenchers got to understand the enormity of the upset and resistance to this. Each and every colleague is being inundated with emails, calls. People are stopping you in the street to express their anger. It was also expressed on the doorstep when we were doing national campaigning this weekend. The unions are currently meeting at the Trade Unions Congress in Brighton, and many of them agree with those backbenchers and the people who are stopping MPs in the street. This was Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham with an alternative proposal, speaking to the Today programme.
I don't agree that pensioners are the very wealthy. I mean, they've been asked now to fill out a 234 question form in order to get the winter fuel allowance. And let's be really clear here. This is saving minutiae in terms of money. It's £1.2 billion in saving. And at the same time, you've got the 50 richest families in Britain worth £500 billion. £500 billion in the hands of the 50 richest families. Why has Labour made a choice to not tax the 1% wealthiest, which would get £25 billion back into the pot? Black hole gone, £3 billion left over.
Unite will be putting forward a motion at the TUC calling for a 1% tax on the richest 1% of UK residents. The Rail and Maritime Union is backing that motion. RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch told Sky why it was necessary.
What are you calling for exactly?
Well, there are a number of taxes that you can look at. An astute person like Rachel Reeves can look at that. She's got a number of levers at her disposal. The problem is that she's chosen to declare that she's not going to use very many of them. And the main thing is that she won't borrow for investment. So we need loads of investment, as everyone can see. Many of our cities and communities are crumbling at the minute. We need to rebuild the infrastructure. That includes our schools and our hospitals, but also the engineering and civil infrastructure that we need to put together. So it's up to her how she goes about it. We're not here to dictate to the Chancellor, who's a very astute person, about what she's got to do, but she shouldn't delimit herself in such a way that she seems to have done in the run-up to her first budget. But she's in for the long term, and we respect that. So you're not going to solve all of the problems of the country in one budget after one election. She's got a bit of time and a bit of room, and she's got to make that room for herself politically and in terms of public relations, if you want to call it that, to make the case, and so has the TUC, that we need a better public spending regime, and that means getting the revenues that the government need to do the things that the public want.
So you have the unions fighting against the cut to pensioners' benefits, and you have Labour backbenchers contemplating rebellion. Now, that's perhaps expected, but there's also harsh criticism coming from some more unexpected quarters. This was Susanna Reid on Good Morning Britain.
Having got in after 14 years, the most headline announcement they make is, we're going to take £300 away from pensioners. It just seems absolutely crackers, and I'm not the only person who thinks that, because we know that scores of Labour MPs think it too.
And
pensioners need every penny.
They do.
Whereas if you put a wealth tax in, you could take £300 from a wealthy individual without them even noticing. A pensioner on the lowest income is going to notice every penny of that £300.
Right. And I know
the winter fuel allowance was brought in by Gordon Brown. And in 2017, Theresa May suggested it might be cut. Labour came out fighting on it. John McDonnell, who was Shadow Chancellor at the time, said that cutting it could lead to 4,000 deaths over the winter. The energy price cap is going up. We know, I've just received an email, like many of us would have done, saying your energy bills are about to go up this winter. But a Labour government, a Labour Prime Minister says we're going to cut the amount of money going to pensioners.
Nobody can understand this cut. Now, it's so unpopular, it's even radicalising Susanna Reid. And of course, you had the Home Secretary's husband there hosting Good Morning Britain with her, the sort of bizarre spectacle, which is the British political media establishment. Keir Starmer's cut to the winter fuel allowance even has some Tory newspapers wishing for the good old days of Jeremy Corbyn. This is from the Daily Mail. According to Labour's own research, Starmer's plan to strip 10 million pensioners of the winter fuel payment could kill almost 4,000 people. Now, that research was published in 2017 when Jeremy Corbyn was fighting off Theresa May's attempt to cut the benefit. Starmer was, of course, a member of the shadow cabinet at the time. The Prime Minister doesn't appear to be backing down, though. He gave this interview to Laura Kuenssberg over the weekend.
If a Labour MP votes against you this week when winter fuel is debated in the House of Commons, will you suspend them or kick them out of the party?
Well, that'll be a matter for the Chief Whip,
But
and
you're
we'll
the Prime
assess that
Minister,
as we
you
go
must have a
along.
view.
But we're going into a vote. I'm glad we're having a vote because I think it's very important for Parliament to speak on this. But every Labour MP was elected in on the same mandate as I was, which should deliver the change that we need for the country over the time we've got in office. I am absolutely convinced that we will only deliver that change. I'm absolutely determined we will, if we do the difficult things now. I know they're unpopular. I know they're difficult. Of course, they're tough choices. But it's a bit like, I don't know, building a house. If you know your foundations are rotten, if you know you've got damp or cracks, you can paint over it. And pretend that you've got a beautiful new house and within 6 months it all falls apart. Or you can say, we're going to strip it down, we're going to fix the foundations. And what then will happen, this is where the hope is there, what then happens is you've got a much better house at the end of the exercise, a country built to last. And that's what I'm determined we're going to bring about in the time that we've got in office.
This is a really stupid mess that the Labour Party have got themselves into. Also very frustrating there, really, sort of this idea. You need to fix the foundations. If you've got a dodgy house, you need to make sure it doesn't have damp. Rachel Reeves has basically indicated that she's going to cut the capital budget. She said, I want to stick to my fiscal rules. Therefore, what am I going to stop doing? We're going to have to stop sort of improving various bits of infrastructure here and there. You know, if you've got a dodgy house, the last thing you should do is say, oh, we couldn't possibly borrow any money. So let's let it continue to creak, right? It doesn't really make much sense. But that's Keir Starmer saying it's a tough decision. It's a difficult decision that I've got to make, but I've got no choice. I mean, of course, he did have a choice. The line is getting more than a little stale and prompting this reaction from, again, GMB's Susanna Reid when she spoke to Home Office Minister Diana Johnson.
I think it's a really difficult decision.
You've said, can I just ask
that.
for our view, on behalf of our viewers, can you stop saying it's a difficult decision?
Okay.
Right? We all understand you have to make choices. You've made this particular choice. You didn't find it difficult because you made it. So is it the right decision?
Well, I'm a Home Office Minister. This is a decision by the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Do you think it's a right decision? You're in the government. You're a minister.
Can I just say, she's got the overview of government that I haven't got. I've got an overview of what's happening in the Home Office, and I've explained to you about the black hole there.
Let me ask, will you vote for it tomorrow?
I will reluctantly have to vote for it, yes.
So you think it's the right decision then?
I recognise that we are making some really difficult decisions because of the inheritance of the last 14 years.
I am going to say on behalf of can you stop saying it's a difficult decision?
It's a hard decision. It's a really hard decision.
I don't think that's what she meant. Can you stop saying it's a difficult decision? Okay, it's a hard decision. Not a decision we wanted to make. Awkward decision. Reluctant decision. It's not the precise adjective you're using. It's the fact that there's an unwillingness to sort of really tackle the issue that people have with this policy, which is that, yes, I mean, from my perspective, there probably are a lot of pensioners who don't really need that extra 300 quid. I can think of some off the top of my head. But there are a lot of people who are getting caught out who aren't on those pension tax credits, but who also aren't very wealthy, which is why people are getting really, really pissed off about this. Why then are the government pushing this line so hard and potentially spending a lot of political capital, loads of political capital on this? Going to war with pensioners is never a particularly successful political strategy in this country. One government source, told The Times this about the policy. It is a signal to the markets that the Chancellor is prepared to make politically difficult, unpopular choices to remain fiscally disciplined. She's sort of saying to the market, I mean, by the way, there was an interesting sort of Robert Peston tweet about this. The markets kind of trust Rachel Reeves anyway, because she's been banging on about her fiscal rules for such a long time. And £1.4 billion is really nothing. Right? It's such a small amount of money. There isn't going to be a run on the pound because a Labour Chancellor has decided not to scrap a benefit that's been in place since 1997. Right? Doesn't make any sense. When Liz Truss got into trouble, that's because they were doing something radically new, and they were doing something radically new without having it costed in any way whatsoever or going to the OBR, right? So it's dramatic cutting of taxes. They didn't have a long-term plan. The markets didn't like it. Labour have come in, and I haven't seen any sort of signal whatsoever, and I haven't sort of read in the financial press really either that all of these investors are saying, oh, Rachel Reeves must get rid of the winter fuel allowance, otherwise there's going to be a run on the pound. It's weird. It's sort of building up the markets to be, one, a bit more powerful than they actually are, and two, a bit more interested in sort of the minutiae of policy detail like this. It's sort of really building them up as a big boogeyman to give them cover to just do crappy policy. Like if you're going to build up a boogeyman as cover to do policy, do some policy that's interesting, not just making it a bit harder for pensioners to afford their energy bills. Another source told The Times the policy was basic democracy, saying this: we're not going to move on it. We were elected first and foremost to sort out the public finances. That means tough decisions. Rachel has the total backing of Number 10 in doing this. This is just not true. If you look at their election campaign, I suppose they did talk a lot about their fiscal rule, to be fair. But the reason they won that election is because people were sick of costs being high. They were sick of the NHS not working. If you did a poll of the British public, why did you vote Labour at the last election? I mean, first off, most of them will just say because the Tories are a complete mess. And they wouldn't say the Tories are a complete mess, by the way, because of the public finances. They'd say the Tories are a complete mess because we're paying lots for our fuel and the NHS is a complete mess, right? No one's saying, oh, the fiscal situation isn't quite in check, so therefore we have to vote Labour. That's not what happened. According to Politico, Chancellor Rachel Reeves will address unhappy Labour MPs tonight, and it will be behind closed doors, and she'll try and convince them to back the winter fuel payment cut at tomorrow's vote. Apparently they're in that meeting as we speak. Ash, they have got themselves in a pickle here, haven't they?
They really have, and I've been trying to make sense of it because there's one explanation, which is just that these actually aren't particularly adept politicians. Part of the reason why they were able to soar into power in the way that they did was the fact that there was sort of confluence of interests. One was, of course, the rabid loathing of the Labour left on the part of much of the media, which inflated the status of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And the second was capitalising on the collapse of the Tory party, which was once more aided along by the fact that the journalists who helped, completely shitefest Boris Johnson and the following Muppets into power, then suddenly noticed that they were all totally unfit to govern. So one explanation is that these actually aren't super astute politicians. They had a totally inflated status because of the media, and we're now starting to see the weaknesses of that political decision making. That's one explanation. Another explanation might be that what Reeves is modelling herself on is the decisions taken by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So one of the very first things that New Labour did after coming into power in 97, of course, we think about all the things that they did in terms of PFI and finding ways to boost public spending effectively on the cheap, because a lot of it got privatised and caused huge problems down the line. But one of the very first things that he did was introduce a benefits cut. And it was a benefits cut which particularly impacted single mothers. I remember this because my mum was a single mum at the time. Now, why did he do that? I think it was a sort of, oh, well, we really are New Labour. We really have embraced some of the fiscal tenets of Thatcherism. We're not old Labour, and we're going to go after one of the constituencies that we were always accused of being too soft on. It's a sort of positioning thing and appealing to an audience, whether it's the markets or right-wing papers, to sort of show how centrist and how right-wing you really are. So I think, these are two explanations. I'm not really sure which of those I'm sold on yet. Maybe a combination of the two. But the last thing that I suppose I'd like to say is, you've got these two things being true at once in this country. One is that our state pension provision is really low, particularly when you compare it to other European countries. That is utterly true. We have a completely shameful proportion of pensioners and older people in various forms of poverty, including fuel poverty. And you also have a massive concentration of wealth, mostly housing wealth, amongst older people. So what do you do about that? Do you introduce more means testing? Do you cut back on the universality of provisions like winter fuel allowances? What the problem is that when you introduce various forms of means testing, you try and link it to the pension credit, is that there will be very deserving people who, for whatever reason, just miss out. And so that's how you end up with that 2017 piece of research, which suggested that linking winter fuel allowance to pension credits could result in the deaths of 4,000 people. There will be people who miss out. So, sure, you can roll back on the universality of policies, or what you could do is introduce forms of wealth taxes which target the wealthy rather than just older people as a whole. So that might be in the form of doing something that we've discussed many times, Michael, equalising capital gains tax with income tax. So it means that if you are a pensioner, but you have a substantive income because of investments, you're going to be taxed on that the way a worker would be taxed on that. That would be a really good thing. Another thing would be increasing inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is entirely unearned. I mean, inheritance is entirely unearned, unless you've I don't know, killed a loved one, but even then you should be ruled out of inheritance. You haven't earned it, right? So inheritance tax is a completely fair form of tax because inheritance is itself unearned. That would be one way of addressing the concentration of asset wealth amongst older people. You deal with it when they pass on, you recoup some of that to the Treasury, and you can use that for capital investment or day-to-day spending, like on the benefits budget. These are all alternatives to, cutting the winter fuel allowance and linking it to pension credits. But the reason why Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have, at least thus far, ruled these things out is because, they said no new taxes in their first term. Whether or not they'll stick to that promise is another thing entirely. I think that they may shift on it. But it would have been better to shift on the, no new taxes thing than cutting winter fuel allowance for older people, which will be a complete disaster for many households up and down the country later this winter.
They didn't say no new taxes at all. They said no increase in income tax, national insurance, or corporation tax. And I think what's happened here in terms of like where the Labour strategy has tripped over itself a little bit is they thought if they promise not to raise any of the big taxes, then that will get them through the election. And then when they're in power, they can raise lots of little taxes or cut or save money in lots of little specific areas. So save $1 billion here, raise $1 billion there, save $1 billion here, raise $1 billion there. And they thought if we get this in sort of these tiny little chunks, no one will notice. But actually, it turns out if you try and do it in these tiny little chunks, people are way more inclined to notice it than if you do one of the big ones. So obviously when the Tories sort of cut national insurance, no one really noticed. When Gordon Brown increased national insurance to pay for the NHS, it was really popular. And that raises, or loses in the case of the Tories cutting it, loads of money. So the national insurance cut has cost £10 billion a year. So if they'd taken a bit of a political hit by increasing that by 1p, then they had loads of money to play with. But instead they're going for all of these different ones. And the first saving they've tried to make, this is the first saving they've tried to make, right? It's quite significant, really backfired. There must be, because apparently, she has this plan in the budget where she's going to raise sort of 10 different little taxes, do some little cuts here. They're going to be going through them all thinking, oh my God, this is going to be an absolute nightmare. If they kicked off over this, they're really going to kick off over these other things that we had planned that we thought maybe they wouldn't notice. Ash, I suppose my question here for you, you mentioned the sort of the cut to benefits for single mums under New Labour. And I suppose now I'm sort of imagining Rachel Reeves going through her budget for October and sort of saying, oh, maybe this is going to backfire more than it did, and sort of reassessing where the cuts will be, where the tax rises will be. Is there a more cynical reading of the politics we've seen over the past couple of weeks, which is essentially the reason this is really backfiring for the Labour Party is because they've gone for a constituency who actually has quite a lot of political power, which is pensioners. So it's like what brought down Liz Truss is she affected mortgage holders. What's really causing Labour a headache is that this has hit pensioners. So maybe, if you're a pure, brutal political strategist in Rachel Reeves' office, you'll say, look, if you want to save some money, go for a less powerful constituency. Right? Let's reassess. Let's look at the single mums again. Could they be in there thinking we need to hit less powerful constituencies if we want to save money?
Who's had it too good for too long, Michael? Them single mums. I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, right? So pensioners are relatively politically powerful. Now, I'm not talking about impoverished pensioners because they're actually very disempowered, but pensioners as an entire group, relatively politically powerful because they turn out for elections, right? They're a high turnout voter group. And secondly, there's also a geographic spread of them, which makes them more important in more constituencies than younger people who tend to cluster and stack up their votes in urban concentrations, right? So even though there are lots of young people, they're all concentrated in the same places. So they don't matter in elections where you win by seats, you don't win by people. So that's what I was sort of hinting at when I was saying, well, maybe these aren't that savvy politicians, because you take the morality out of it, you're going for a relatively powerful group quite early on. And I think you're right to draw that comparison with Liz Truss. There are two groups of people that you can't really afford to alienate in the electoral system that we have. It's homeowners and it's pensioners.
They're going to come for us. Actually, you've got a house, Ash. They're going to come for me next. Renting podcast hosts in their mid-30s are really going to feel the heat over the next few years. The new Labour government has been a mixed bag in terms of progressive policies, but this one can definitely go in the good column. The Transport Secretary has announced plans to introduce a law that will allow more bus services to be brought under local control. Bus services were once upon a time all under local control and run by publicly owned companies. This was the norm. That changed in 1986 when services outside London were deregulated and privatised. That led to public-owned companies being sold off and private bus companies all competing to operate the most profitable routes. The situation in London was slightly different. So here bus operators were still sold off, like in the rest of the country, but the overall management of the system was still kept under local government control. So London authorities would decide what bus routes they wanted, then they'd offer those routes to private companies to manage. This is known as a franchise model. While it might not be perfect, it has functioned in a much better manner than the fully deregulated system that came into operation everywhere else. So the Wild West system they've had in the rest of the country is beginning to come to an end, and everywhere might look a bit more like London when it comes to the management of public transport. Now, announcing this new move, Transport Secretary Louise Haigh said this: buses are the lifeblood of our communities, but for too many people, it has become impossible to rely on local services as routes have been slashed and timetables hollowed out. Today is the first stop on our journey to delivering better buses across the country. After decades of failed deregulation, local leaders will finally have the powers to provide services that deliver for passengers. Labour's new bill will not be the first step towards re-regulating Britain's buses. So in 2017, the Tory government actually passed a bill which allowed combined mayoral authorities to create publicly controlled bus systems. And last year, Greater Manchester launched its own integrated transport service called the B Network. Labour's bill will extend these powers to all local authorities. Earlier today, I spoke to Matthew Topham from the group We Own It, which campaigns in favour of public ownership, and I started by asking him how significant these Labour announcements were.
We're going to be seeing a game-changing level of power handed out to areas that don't have a metro mayor. So that's a really exciting opportunity for councils who aren't under devolution yet to wrestle back control of their bus network. So it's no longer a Wild West kind of zombie Thatcher experiment, that they can actually, without having to wait around on Westminster, take over the direct kind of setup of their bus network.
Will local authorities sort of have the capacity to do this? I suppose, I can see how with the metro mayors, they're these sort of big organisations, they can sort of get a lot of expertise in-house, let's say. If you've got a local authority, which, as we know, lots of them are already sort of on their knees, are they going to be able to manage the bus services?
So it is a power that I think that they can start to use, but it has to come, as you say, hand in hand with funding local government. We used to have publicly owned, publicly controlled bus networks in this country, like every other European country does, done at a regional level, a local government level. But that was back when we funded local government properly. Since then, we've restricted the ability of local government to raise its own funds very significantly. And we've also seen massive, kind of a third cut to the amount of grant they get from national government. So it does need to come hand in hand with funding for local government. But whatever happens, it will be better than the scenario we have now, where local councils are handing over millions of pounds a year already to private operators for services they have very little say over, and without the ability to benefit from that effective subsidy investment in the service, because any profit that gets made from propping up the bus network goes to those private operators and not back to the public who are doing the investment in the first place.
Oh, I'm going to ask a really basic question here, because I didn't realise so these private bus companies, as it stands, they're already getting public money from local authorities. Is that correct? Because I thought that the whole point of privatisation and deregulation is they're supposed to go it alone. They make a profit from tickets, and that's that. But no, you're saying local authorities are already handing them loads of cash.
Absolutely. So already handing them loads of cash. And that's the quiet bit. The free marketeers will like to say loudly, it's all about, who can survive in a market, whether it's making a profit. But the quiet bit is this whole system is propped up by, on average, 40% of revenue for bus operators coming from different forms of grant from the public. So the public pay twice. We pay when we get on the bus, and we pay through our council taxes and other taxes we pay. And so actually, we need to be getting control back of that funding we're already giving them through kind of public institutions. And the figure goes way beyond 40% in some regions. It's up to half or more is coming from public subsidy. And yet we've, to date, had very little control over the services we get.
I suppose that's to sort of coax them into continuing to do services that might otherwise be unprofitable. So presumably it's the case that in many places there are some routes which are very profitable because lots of people travel, down that road or whatever, and there'll be other routes which aren't, which have to be, I suppose, loss-making routes, and that's where local governments are giving these companies money. Could you talk about the impact of privatisation deregulation since the 1980s? As far as I understand, there aren't many people saying this was a massive success. But sort of, can you tell us, sort of, in terms of numbers, in terms of evidence, why can we say confidently that sort of that experiment failed?
The most striking thing is that back in the last 5 years, we've had a UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights come to the UK to do a report on the situation here. And he was so struck with the way in which our privatised and deregulated bus system, which of course is unique in Europe and pretty unique in the world. The only other place that springs to mind was Pinochet-era Chile, that has got a system like this. He was so struck that he came back and did a report purely on the impacts on human rights and poverty of bus privatization, finding that it had serious human rights impacts. And so that, I think, has got to be the starting point. His colleagues in that piece of research went through the white paper that Margaret Thatcher put forward on why bus privatization and deregulation would benefit. It's going to increase competition, so ticket prices will be lower. There'll be more routes, et cetera, and went through and debunked each of them. We've seen a doubling in real terms of the cost of travel by bus. We're seeing far fewer routes. And not only do we see fewer routes, the routes that remain, you can only ride during the core hours of the day. You can't go out for a pint at night. You can't get to your early morning shift on the NHS. And the frequencies themselves continue to decline. So on point after point, we have seen this be a failure. And you can point to all the numbers, but then it comes to what the stories are. The stories of folks with disabilities cut off from their lives. I know someone who has had to move house, uproot her family because she can no longer get to work reliably. And at a time when there's a cost of living crisis going on, the costs and the stress of having to move house have been a massive burden, all because the bus network is set up, as you say, to cream a profit off the busy routes and then leave everyone else out in the cold. If the route isn't turning a profit in itself, there's no desire to cross-subsidize and treat the whole system as a public service.
At the risk of getting a little bit technical, can you explain to me and my audience the difference between public authorities getting the right to give out franchises, essentially, for routes, and public ownership of the bus network?
Absolutely. It's a really important distinction. And it's one, when you talk about public control and public ownership, it can feel like you're kind of losing the difference there. So this franchising system gives a degree of control back to a local authority, because at the minute, it's a Wild West free market. Anyone, if you've got the money, and potentially if you have a relevant bus depot in the region, can set up and run a service. You've basically got no restrictions on your ability to do that. But what that means is there are effective monopolies for the people who own the depots locally. Those depots were built by councils way back in the 1980s and before, but now owned by private companies. And they have carte blanche to set up a service, to cut a service, to charge what fares they like, etc. So it's all this Wild West market. Franchising public control means you can only run a service in the region of that local authority if you win a contract from the mayor or from the relevant authority. And that contract specifies it's got to have this route with this timetable using these sorts of fares, and potentially, and this is an area we need to push for further, with these sorts of rights and responsibilities for good employment practices, good climate practices, good disability rights and responsibilities. And so that's something you can start to write in. But that doesn't mean that contract is getting operated by a publicly owned company. What it means is, and this is what we see in London at the minute and Manchester, a competitive tender happens and it's basically outsourced, like so many other council services get outsourced. And so while less profit leaks out because you're paying a smaller contract fee than they get under their Wild West system, you're still seeing a degree of profit leak out of the system. And so that's why we want to see what the gold standard is across much of Europe, which is you hand your contract directly to a council-owned, a local authority-owned bus company. So there's no wasting money on a competitive tender. There's no wasting time on that. There's no wasting of profits that are leaking out to those operators. You reinvest all of the money that you collect through fares.
Sometimes in social policy, I have a bit of a sort of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And my London centricity is going to come out here. But it seems like Transport for London's bus system doesn't work too bad. When I go to different cities where they've got these deregulated systems, they're both privatized and deregulated. It does seem completely crazy. You don't know how much you're going to pay for a bus because there's different companies. You've got some routes where you've got loads of some roads where you've got loads of buses, other roads where you've got none. It seems irrational. The London franchising system, it doesn't seem to me that this obviously needs radical reform, and which I suppose sort of the renationalisation of the stock would be. What's your sort of argument as to why it would be a priority to move away from the franchising system in London and now Manchester to something which is sort of more fundamentally publicly owned?
So it wouldn't be moving away from a franchising system. It would be handing the contract directly to a publicly owned operator. And that's what we're talking about doing on the railways. Labour has just written into law, let's hand these rail franchises as default to a public operator because we think that's better. It allows you to have potentially more of a democratic oversight of the running of the service. That's how often these things happen in Europe. So that greater level of control, removing a kind of private contract management fee is useful. The comparison in newly franchised regions on profits is also quite telling to me. So on the Wild West market, operators had a 13% profit margin. That was higher than what the CMA thought was fair for them to be making because it was basically a monopoly. So to move to franchising, you're going from 13% profit to 7% profit in Manchester. So sure, you've now got a whole load of extra retained profit that you can play with under franchising, but it's half of what you could be using. And down the line, we're hopefully going to have even more money to be playing with because as we reinvest those savings from franchising and potentially from public ownership, we'll get more people riding the bus and then we'll get more money back through fares. And so it's a kind of positive growth cycle. And then the third thing that quickly comes to mind is in London, there's been a massive attack on drivers' terms and conditions because these operators are bidding in on these tender competitions to try and give the lowest bid, the lowest cost to local authority. And the way they do that is often by attacking the driver's terms and conditions. And that means that every time the contract changes hands, the drivers see a whole load of pain come their way. They may have to drive an extra half an hour to get to the depot because their bus routes changed depot. They may now be getting paid a worse basic rate or a worse enhanced rate. They may now have worse setup for getting comfort breaks, things like getting to go to the loo on a 2-hour bus journey where you're looking after thousands of people. So the ability to have better control and more stability for those workers as well is a key thing. So it kind of comes to decision-making, democracy, an enhancement in how much money you're saving from stopping profit leaking out, and then kind of bread and butter things like a better employed workforce, not only because that's the right thing to do, but because that is of benefit to us as passengers. Because if you're greeted by a bus driver who's got good terms and conditions, your experience on the buses will be better in itself.
A new report into BBC bias on Israel's assault on Gaza has been released. And for those who've been watching the BBC's coverage of the war over the last year, its findings may come as a surprise. This is how The Telegraph wrote up the report. The BBC breached its own guidelines 1,500 times over the war, with its coverage heavily biased against Israel. The report was compiled using artificial intelligence to analyse around 2,000 articles published by the BBC in both English and Arabic, as well as transcripts of hundreds of hours of audio and video output. ChatGPT was asked to rate the items in the dataset based on whether it created sympathy for Israel or Palestine. According to the report, the AI found that the BBC's output was 3 to 6 times more sympathetic to Palestine than to Israel. The study also did some quantitative analysis, counting up how many times certain words were used in relation to Israel versus Palestine. Now, it found that the BBC linked the phrase war crimes to Israel nearly 130 times versus 30 times to Hamas. Genocide was linked to Israel nearly 300 times, but just 19 times to Hamas. It was a similar result for the phrase breach of international law, whereas crimes against humanity was linked to Hamas a little more than to Israel. Now, this, to me, seems like a stupid method, right? So you've got ChatGPT to read a load of articles and said, you, Mr. AI, do you feel more positive about Israel or Palestine after reading this? Now, the thing to know, especially I saw that chart on Twitter, and it just struck me as completely ridiculous. Of course, there are more stories that associate Israel with, well, genocide because there was a case at the International Criminal Court, or war crimes because Israel are literally killing people every day, right? Hamas did what they did on one day, October the 7th, right? There were lots and lots of reports about that. I don't think anyone can suggest that that was an event in the world which was undercovered, which was underreported, right? It clearly wasn't. And actually, by the way, lots of the stuff which was reported about it was spurious. Lots of it obviously wasn't spurious. Lots of it was real in terms of the outrages which were committed. But there were lots of spurious reporting about that. I think you'd really struggle to suggest that the British media, the Western media, didn't take October the 7th seriously, right? But they've said because they've put the word genocide or war crimes next to Israel more often than Hamas, that shows bias. There's a simpler explanation, which is that Israel have been doing what they've been doing for months, and they've killed, well, now about 40 times as many people as were killed on October the 7th. It is, of course, worth bearing in mind the report looked at articles published between October the 7th last year and February 7th this year. So in terms of that word genocide, this is key. It did include the period when South Africa successfully filed a case against Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice. So successful in the sense that the International Court of Justice said they would take this up. Not successful in the sense that the International Court said this is genocide, but that was never the intention anyway. That was, of course, a pretty newsworthy event. You can't complain that the BBC put the word genocide with Israel in a bunch of articles when Israel were being taken to the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, for genocide. The report also tries to back up the AI findings with the assessment of 6 human reviewers. They agreed with the AI findings, though the report points out that they were, quote, mostly Jewish people with personal connections to Israel. So not necessarily unbiased themselves. The BBC has responded to the report, saying it will carefully consider its findings, but expressing concerns about its methodology, which seemed very much fair enough. The spokesperson for the corporation also said, quote, we don't think coverage can be assessed solely by counting particular words divorced from context. The report also singles out 2 journalists for being especially biased. This is what they claim, at least. They are Lise Doucette and Jeremy Bowen, so 2 very senior journalists at the BBC. On Jeremy Bowen, The Telegraph reports this. It cites, this is about this report into BBC supposed bias, it cites several examples, including a podcast last November in which Mr. Bowen stated Hamas is an Islamic resistance movement we've seen in the past few weeks has a military strategy. That's just true. And News at 10 report last October in which he said, and a News at 10 report last October in which he said, Hamas will try and use hit and run guerrilla tactics against a much more powerful army. There's no bias there. They are a guerrilla army. They use guerrilla tactics, and the Israeli army is much more powerful than Hamas. Of course, unless you speak in the language of Hamas are evil, bad terrorists, Israel, good country, then you're seen as biased. And that seems to be what's being suggested here. They go on. It compares this to Mr. Bowen stating on a News at 10 report last October, Israel has settled hundreds of thousands of Jews in defiance of international law. And in a podcast that month, I saw the huge amount of force that they, so Israel, have there and the massive amount of physical damage they've done, not to mention the loss of life. But despite all of that, Hamas is still fighting. It claims Mr. Bowen has also compared Israel's offensive to Gaza to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including in a BBC article in November last year in which he stated Israel is on course to have killed as many Palestinian civilians in just over a month as Russia has killed in Ukraine since February 2022. Now, everything they've pointed out there is just completely true. I would say fairly balanced. Defending his colleagues, senior BBC foreign correspondent John Simpson said this. The BBC says it has serious questions about the methodology of the attack on BBC reporting of Gaza in today's Sunday Telegraph. Jeremy Bowen and Lise Doucette, who are singled out for vicious criticism, are known worldwide as 2 of the finest correspondents in world journalism. Ash, a couple of questions for you here. I mean, what do you make of this report? I found that chart completely laughable. I suppose as well, though, on a more fundamental level, is this just what pro-Israel people do? And is it just a mirror image of what we do as people who are critical of Israel when we sort of all saying, oh, the BBC is really biased. The BBC say, look, we're somewhere in between. We're getting attacked from both sides, and surely we're doing something right.
Well, I think the first thing you've got to look at is the fact that this is part of a strategy on behalf of pro-Israel advocates across the global north, and in particular in English-speaking countries, Britain and America, where there is a concerted effort on behalf of well-resourced organisations, often with close connections to the Israeli embassy in these respective countries to monitor mainstream media coverage of Israel and lodge complaint after complaint after complaint of what are largely fact-based news items. Now, from the examples that you can see in this report, the objection seems to be that unless you describe Hamas as somehow subhuman, demonic, barbaric, and you use actively incredibly negative language to describe them factually and to try and provide a dispassionate analysis, that is itself a expression of bias in favor of Hamas or bias against Israel. So what it does is it defines bias as anything which isn't explicitly pro-Israel or almost cartoonishly anti-Hamas. You have to get all those caveats in before you can discuss Hamas in any way possible. So the project is to define these terms in such a way that it makes it impossible to tell the truth about what's happening in Israeli politics, in terms of Israeli military strategy, and also in terms of Hamas military strategy, because you're tying up media organizations in vexatious complaints all the time. That's the strategy. Now, I can understand how the vantage point of the BBC is they say, well, look, these pro-Israel advocates are ideologically motivated people and pro-Palestinian advocates are ideologically motivated people. So if everyone is yelling at us that that's correct, well, you have to look at the basis of complaints. Now, the complaints which are being lodged against the BBC from the Palestinian side are looking at differences not in quantity of coverage, but what language is being used to describe the same thing. So the passive voice being used when the IDF kill Palestinians. It's like Palestinians killed after explosion. No one can really say why in a headline when it was an Israeli airstrike. Or using quite loaded words like massacre to describe the October 7th attacks and, military operation to describe what is being carried out in Gaza. Now, what that implies is a difference and a value judgment being made in certain kinds of violence. It's not creating, okay, we're going to describe all acts of violence and all military operations in these ways. It's actually about creating a hierarchy. So that's where I think you've got to look at the substance of the complaints of what they are, rather than just saying, well, it's coming from two sides and one is a mirror image of the other. I don't think that they are. And also the last thing that I suppose I would say is that there is something comical about saying, okay, well, we fed all these news items through an AI and it came out with an unfavorable image of Israel. That's indicating that there's bias in those news articles, rather than we exist in a reality where even if you don't agree that what Israel is doing in Gaza is a genocide, I very strongly believe that it is a genocide, but even if you don't believe it is, there is a huge asymmetry in the loss of life, huge asymmetry in terms of the power differential, and a huge asymmetry in terms of military capabilities, that to describe those things factually, that you could only be biased. Right, you can only be biased if you come out with a negative opinion of that description of reality. It's only because that there's bias going on, rather than it is a description of reality which would lead you towards a negative view of Israel. Because if you kill tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children, and you have children regularly being taken to the hospital with sniper wounds to the head, well, maybe if you learn about these things, you would have a negative view of Israel. That's a reflection of reality. It's not a reflection of bias. I suppose the last, very, very last thing I'd say is that one of the things that's really important to remember about the pro-Israel strategy is that they've employed what is often known as the electric fence strategy. So they make the cost of describing what Israel is doing so high, right, create so much trouble and headache and hoopla that it creates a climate of self-censorship amongst media organizations. So that's the point of reports such as these. I don't think it's necessarily to be taken seriously as a report, but to contribute an environment where journalists self-censor and editors preemptively censor or augment their editorializing of such news pieces because they don't want the hassle.
I think it is really telling what they've chosen as sort of the offending sentences from Jeremy Bowen. Like the idea that Hamas could have a military strategy is itself offensive, right? These have to just be irrational, raving, barbaric lunatics. And to even sort of rationalize what they're doing in any way, not to justify, but to rationalize what they're doing, is itself an act of bias. Now, I think most people who watch this show will recognize that the approach we have is very critical of what Israel are doing, right? I don't necessarily think that's bias. I personally just think that's sort of describing what's going on. But I mean, if you watch it, we're clearly, a lot more negative about the Israeli government than we are about Palestinian resistance movements, let's say, or we talk about that more. But we've never sort of suggested Israel doesn't have a strategy. Like, I'm always actually quite firm about this. Israel aren't sort of evil lunatics motivated by sort of this sort of bizarre, irrational desire to destroy things. No, they have a strategy. They want more land, right? They want more land, and they don't want to have to share it with the Palestinians. Right? I don't think they are punishing Palestine. I mean, there might be some people here and there who are just sadistic, but I don't think Israeli state policy is driven by sort of lunatic barbarism. I think it's driven by rational self-interest of a particular project, which is an expansionary one, right? We rationalize what Israel are doing all the time. That's not to justify it. But what's going on here is that the pro-Israel people think if we rationalize both sides, if we see both sides as humans with normal human interests, well, not normal's too loaded, with understandable or comprehensible, let's say, I think both sides have comprehensible human interests at play, then maybe people will end up sympathizing more with the Palestinians, and therefore we have to make one of them sort of humans that we can identify with and understand their motives, and the other barbarians who don't even have logic, which seems to be what's going on here. I would also say that on this show, whenever we obviously we do talk about media bias quite a lot, I'm always, and I think you all notice it sort of if you look at our segments on this kind of thing, I'm always a lot more sympathetic to the journalists on the ground, even from the Western media outlets, right? I think Jeremy Bowen is a good journalist. And when I have complaints about how this is covered in Western media, is much more, obviously, I think it's perfectly fine to criticize a journalist who is on the ground in a war zone. I don't think that should be taboo or out of bounds. But I think where you see the bias in Western media is so much more when you get into the newsroom in London or New York or Washington than it is when you have these people on the ground, because the journalists on the ground who've spent lots of time in Palestine, as Jeremy Bowen and Lise Doucette have, they do, I think, report reasonably well. I'm sure you can criticize them here and there, but it's not the same sort of dehumanizing bias that you see sometimes in TV studios and in, of course, newspaper comment pages. The Green Party has long had an awkward contradiction, I think, at the heart of its policy agenda. The Greens have always, and rightly, asked Britons to swap cars and planes for buses and trains, but they've also vociferously opposed one of the main infrastructure projects that would do more than most to increase rail capacity in the UK, HS2, High Speed 2. Now, and I'm pleased to say that is until their conference this weekend, Green Party members have now voted to reverse the party's opposition to HS2, demanding that the rail project be built in full. So they're actually going further than the Labour Party now in their position on HS2. Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer said this about the vote. The Green Party has long supported the principle of a new north-south high-speed rail line, but had serious concerns about the specific route of HS2 and the environmental impacts of this route. However, this first phase of HS2 between London and Birmingham is well underway, and most of the environmental impacts of construction are already baked in. This is a pragmatic decision by the Green Party. It moves us on. Crucially, we have also acknowledged that the northern leg of HS2 was always the most important in terms of tackling capacity issues on our railways, as well as addressing regional inequalities, so the line must be completed in full. This weekend, the Green Party also voted to recognise Israel's assault on Gaza as a genocide. The party has also affirmed its support for the BDS movement and the total suspension of arms to Israel. A bit more from the Green Party conference. There's now also news that left-wingers in the party are getting more organised. A group provisionally called Greens Organise has formed to push the party in an anti-capitalist direction and to fight what they call electoral assimilation. A source from the group told The Guardian this: the Green Party can make the positive case for something better. Compromise has gotten us to the edge of climate disaster and a resurgent far right. The time for a bolder politics is now. The Green Party already has transformative left-wing policies that would take power back from big business and put it in people's hands. We should be proud of this, and Greens organised want to help the party bring this message to the wider left. 3 developments there, Ash, to talk about. What's your take on what we've seen this weekend at the Green Party conference?
Well, I suppose I want to talk about this initiative being led by Greens Organise. So I want to separate the strategic questions from the moral and the political ones, because the moral and political ones are like, well, I agree with taking the Green Party in a more internationalist, more connected to the trade union movement and internationalist direction, right? I agree with all these things. Strategically, I'm interested in how this grouping within the Green Party and others who I know are interested in, working within the Green Party to take it in a more left-wing direction and a more anti-imperialist direction on foreign policy. I'm interested in their strategy, all right? Because the first thing is that you're doing electoralism. And if you're doing electoralism, it means you're doing it within the system that we've got, all right? Yes, we would all like a more proportional system, some kind of proportional representation. There's no incentive for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party in opposition to adopt that as a policy. There's no reason for them to want to give up the leverage that they have of these massive parliamentary majorities. So within the system that we've got, if you've got a party like the Greens, ultimately you're looking at the Greens going into coalition probably with Labour or maybe a Labour SNP, something like that. Were that to be the case, I imagine that there could be some significant and really important compromises being made on domestic policy. So you might get things like a wealth tax, you might get things like more investment in infrastructure, you might get things like a massive insulation project across the country, things of that nature. But one of the things that we saw with the Corbyn movement is that the establishment very much closes ranks around foreign policy and says, you are absolutely not going to get this, right? You're not going to get this. There's going to be an electric fence put around foreign policy. So where you're doing electoralism, where the Greens' pathway to power would probably be as the junior partner in a coalition, I'm interested in what the strategic conversations would be for how to deal with that, for how to deal with the fact that the pressure would be on ditching foreign policy and keeping the domestic stuff. And that's a question, right? I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm not saying that, oh, well, this is going to happen, so there's no point in trying. I'm saying, how has that been anticipated and what are the ideas for dealing with that? My problem is that when you ask that as a strategic question, people come back at you with a moral one where they go, oh, that's the right thing to do. It's like, well, sure, it might be the right thing to do, but how are you going to do it? So if anyone has ideas, I would love to hear them. And that's said in a spirit of genuine openness, not sarcasm.
My take is kind of different. I think the Green Party are already left-wing enough, but I'm getting more boring and social democratic in my old age. Ash, thank you for joining me this evening.
I'm becoming really tanky in my old age, Michael.
We're on our trajectories. Let's see where it takes us. Thanks everyone for watching tonight. Do come back for our show tomorrow for coverage after the Commons vote on the winter fuel payment. Maybe there'll be a bust up. I imagine it'll be one of those situations where everyone tells the press, oh, we're considering voting against it. And then everyone sort of finds something else to do that afternoon. But we shall see. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.